The only thing which doesn't have a biological component is, which language you speak, because that seems to be totally cultural. It's funny, in Germany they're still very touchy about the whole idea of human genetics. Well, I mean, there are reasons, historical reasons why they should be. But you've got to bear in mind that the Brits were just as bad. Everybody's been just as bad. If you listen to Southern Chinese talking about Northern Chinese and vice versa, they think that there are genetic differences between them. But there are. So if you give me a blood sample or a serum sample and allow me to look at 5 different genes between 2 people, I can tell you with almost complete certainty whether they're from Africa or from Europe. Okay, so the idea that we're all the same is wrong. But this is biology. Now, the political idea that we've all got the same rights is correct.
You have publicly speak quite vocal about creationism, and you're anti-creationism. Yes. And would you see eugenics as a form of creationism by human intervention on evolution process?
Well, creationism is just stupid. That's the only word you can use for it.
I'm here with Professor Steve Jones, Emeritus Professor of Human Genetics at UCL.
Emeritus Professor of Genetics at UCL.
Not human genetics.
Not human genetics.
Oh, all right, genetics. And one of the leading scholars in his field. His research focuses on genetics, human evolution on populations, and I believe you use the Snell's model to modify human evolution process. It's really lovely to have a chat with you today. We would love to talk about the concepts of human evolutions and how human evolutions operate in populations, and eventually we will lead to topics into today's main focus of eugenics studies. And so first of all, would you mind talk through about how basic knowledge of how human evolution works, how genetics pass through the population?
There's an interest in human inheritance goes back as far as one can possibly trace it, thousands of years probably. I mean, if you take most of the holy books of different religions, they all start with pedigrees. And in Genesis, verse after verse after verse, A begat B, begat C, begat D, because it was very important to place yourself in context of a particular population, and often in context of a particular social class. And so, where I come from in Wales, for example, it had a very strange system of naming, which you named yourself after your father, and then after his father, and you would. In my case, I would be Stephen ap Thomas, ap Gwilym, ap Dewi, and go back. And the further back, the more apps you had, the more aristocratic you were seen as being. And they were important because in order to farm land in Wales, and Wales was basically a slave of England. There were no human rights in Wales. There weren't many human rights in England, but the Welsh people were not allowed to own land, but they could farm it with the landowner's permission if they could trace themselves down a pedigree from a Welsh king called Hywel the Good, Hywel Da, who I think lived in the 9th century. Okay, so you can trace yourself back that way. But Henry VIII, the English king Henry VIII, who himself actually was Welsh, he brought in a system. I mean, that was very clumsy, that system. But Henry VIII brought in a process of surnames, that you had a surname which you then passed to your children, which passed to their children, which is obviously much better and much simpler. But it's noticeable that quite a lot of Welsh surnames that begin with B or P. For example, Powell means son, ap Howell, son of Howell. Okay, S too means son of. So Jones is son of John. So they're all very genetic in their meaning. Now, English surnames tend to be much more to do with people's jobs. For example, Turner, somebody who turned wood, or a shepherd, somebody who had sheep, and their names came to do with what their professions were. And in modern world, people with those kinds of names tend to be slightly richer and slightly further up the social scale than people with names like mine. Okay. And then when you got into the upper classes, an awful lot of their names were of French origin, because it was the Normans, the ones who arrived in 1066, who came up with the idea of a surname. So that if you were called something like Fitzgerald, that's the French for son of Gerald, you're very likely to be in the upper classes. And that's still true. If you look at names of French origin, they tend to be owned by richer people than names of either English or Welsh origin. So these labels tend to stick for a long time, both culturally and socially.
So, as you said, would you say genetic study will always link back to social class?
Well, they're related to social class, that's for sure. I mean, you inherit all kinds of things. The only thing I can think which that doesn't have any genetic basis is the actual language you speak. Now, I mean, I spoke Welsh until I was 5. I couldn't speak any English. But as far as we know, there may be individual differences in people, genetic differences in the ability of particular individuals to learn languages. And I had a friend who was, apart from that, pretty mad, who could speak fluently 12 languages in very different groups. And that was his life's work, really. That's what he did. And we had somebody here, Cedric Smith, who could do exactly that. He used to learn languages as a hobby. Now, I can't do that. I can speak reasonable French. I think I'm okay in English, and I've forgotten most of my Welsh. So it does sort of place you in society, really, the language you speak and your surname. But so does everything else. The only thing which doesn't have a biological component is which language you speak, because that seems to be totally cultural. And maybe which music you like, that too seems to be totally cultural. But your ability to play music maybe have a strong genetic component. Daniel Barenboim, who was an absolutely extraordinary pianist, who's Brazilian, his son is a pianist, and his father was a musician. So there may well be some individual differences in musical ability, but given that there are individual inborn differences in all kinds of abilities, that's not surprising.
Cool.
It's worth remembering. You can tie it to the eugenics story. What was Galton's book's name? It was called Hereditary Genius. Okay. And he was convinced that people who were geniuses, as he, of course, thought he was, had children who were geniuses, had fathers who were geniuses. And Darwin, was a cousin of Galton, and he was a genius. But if you look at Darwin's descendants today, and they're a very clannish lot. They're very proud of being descended from Darwin, and I don't blame them. Most of them are in high profile, high status jobs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's because of their genetic inheritance. It's almost impossible to separate them, really.
According to that follow-up, is UCL used to be quite keen on eugenic studies, and people always use scientific lens within this topic. So is there actually any concrete significant scientific proof that can be evidence of human differences and how it can be presented to?
Yes, I mean, massive difference. There's a massive amount of physical difference, and if you look at DNA sequences now, which you can sequence the human genome in an hour now. If you look at DNA sequences, it turns out that everybody on Earth, everybody who ever has lived over millions of years, and everybody ever will live, is almost certainly different from everybody else. So the amount of genetic difference is quite astounding. How much of that is actually has a biological effect? It's hard to know. But there used to be the idea there will be a gene for genius or a gene for this and a gene for that. It's looking much more, as I would say, polygenic today. There are genes behind all kinds of abilities, but there are genes behind stature, height, and the heritability of height is 0.7, 70% of the variation in height in a population is due to heritable variation. That does not mean that 70% of your height is due to genes. That's a totally different thing. But in the same way, 70% of your score on an IQ test is due to genetic variation, which means that 70% of the variation in intelligence in a population is due to genetic variation. But there's nothing particularly radical about saying that. I mean, much of blood pressure variation, 40% of that variation is due to genetic variation. So you shouldn't be surprised that stuff is inborn, because it is inborn. As I started off saying, the only thing I know which isn't is the actual language you speak. There was a time when people said, for example, the Chinese people, with his being a tonal language, had a different either system of hearing or of speaking to pick up these very, very different, very subtle tone, which Western language speakers can't understand at all. But that doesn't seem to be true. There's no evidence that that's true.
Thank you. So that would link to the topic of eugenics. And how would you define eugenics?
Well, eugenics, the word was made up by Galton, and it means well-born, right? Okay. The Germans have a word for it, which is Rassenhygiene, which is race hygiene. Okay. Now that's a nasty kind of word, but that's the word they used. They stopped using it now for some reason. I don't quite understand. It's funny, in Germany they're still very touchy about the whole idea of human genetics. Well, I mean, there are reasons, historical reasons why they should be. But you've got to bear in mind that the Brits were just as bad. Everybody's been just as bad. If you listen to Southern Chinese talking about Northern Chinese and vice versa, they think that there are genetic differences between them. But there are. If you talk about Northern Indians talking about Southern Indians, they think there are genetic differences. There are big differences, because the Southern Indians were the Dravidians who were the original inhabitants of India, and the people who migrated in from Europe after the Ice Ages, they look different. They're much lighter in colour. So you can't simply deny the idea of race. I mean, it's funny the way that race is almost never used in evolutionary biology, because it doesn't really have a meaning. It just means it's something different. If you talk about, a species, that kind of has a meaning. We all belong to the species Homo sapiens, although we're looking at some of my students, I sometimes doubt it. But as far as we can see, we're completely interfertile. We can exchange genes, and we can't exchange genes with chimpanzees. People have tried. People have fertilized human eggs with chimpanzee sperm, and vice versa, but they don't develop. So the species, at least in animals, the species concept works reasonably well. But there's plenty of cases of hybridization, hybrid zones, and you would expect that, because species are always changing, and the distribution of species is changing, and that's particularly the case in plants. I mean, many plants, for example, the wheat plants, stuff that makes bread, they're a mixture of at least 5 different ancient grasses, which hybridized more or less by accident, and became polyploid, multiple copies of the genes, and hence much more productive. So this is a very active and ongoing process. Now, what its tie with eugenics is distant. If you're an evolutionary biologist, you spend your time asking about evolutionary change. If you're interested in human evolution, you ask about human evolutionary change. In fact, if you're interested in evolution as a whole, in the old days, when I started, where would you go? You go to fruit flies, which I've worked on in the Death Valley and in Australia and places, or you go to snails. Now, snails seem a weird thing to go to, but you've got to remember how recent our ability to look at human genetic variation is. When I started doing genetics in the 1960s, it wasn't until 1968 that people started the first molecular biology of human populations. And it was done here with a guy called Harry Harris, who was the professor of he was the professor of human. They changed the name away from eugenics, so he was a professor of human genetics, and also in Russia with a guy called Dobzhansky, and also in the States where there were several people who did it, and it became very, it seems obvious that if you look at black people and white people, it seems very obvious and logical to say that they look different, therefore they are different. And the surprise is really that they look different, but they aren't particularly different. They're slightly different. So if you give me a blood sample or a serum sample and allow me to look at 5 different genes between 2 people, I can tell you with almost complete certainty whether they're from Africa or from Europe. Okay, so the idea that we're all the same is wrong. But this is biology. Now, the political idea that we've all got the same rights is correct. Now, there are obvious differences there. There's an age-related business. There was a huge row when there was talk of bringing down the voting age to 16. It was 21 when I grew up. It went down to 18 and to 16. So there are always some filters. People who are mentally disordered, they have to be. Some of them may be diagnosed as unable to make up their minds, unable to vote, but that's rare. People in prisons didn't have the vote. I think they still don't. There's been a lot of argument about that.
I don't think they can. I don't think they can.
No.
Yeah,
the point about prison, insofar British prisons are nothing to be proud about, is to rehabilitate people and get them into society. And if they can vote, that's a start. And I've been around a lot of prisons giving talks and the like. And I mean, I've met some pretty horrendous people, really. In Parkhurst, which is the prison basically it's for the clinically insane or too dangerous to go into homes. I've met some very charming people in Parkhurst. There was a bloke, what was his name? No, it's gone. He had the same name as a famous footballer. You sent me an email, I'll remember it. My brains, at the age of 82, my brains are getting fried. No, it's got, but it was quite bizarre. I went into this place. I was making a television series about genetics and behaviour. Human genetics, a long time ago, 30 years ago. And I met this bloke who'd, quite without warning, had gone out and killed somebody. And not somebody he knew, he'd just gone up to him and stabbed him. So he was hauled in and declared to be criminally insane. And he was telling me about his past, that when he was a boy going to school, he always used to take 2 shirts with him, one of which was a clean shirt. And I say it was a second. One was 2 shirts. So in school he'd always fight. He'd get blood on his shirt. Okay, so he'd stop fighting at about lunchtime, and his shirt would have blood on it, and he'd rinse it out and put the other shirt on. Okay, and so he knew he was going to fight, and I said, well, I mean, I said, well, you've got a life sentence here, and the average duration of a life sentence, and you have to do something pretty awful to get a life sentence. Is in Britain, in England, is 14 years, and he'd been in for 13 years. And I said, oh, well, you must have a reasonable chance of getting out in a year or two if you've been well behaved. And he said, well, I haven't been well behaved. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, I was playing snooker with one of the guards, and he was rude to me, so I killed him. I said, oh. And what he'd done was to get the snooker thing and just bash it over his head. So, obviously he can't be let out. So, and you can make an argument that kind of totally erratic behaviour is inborn. But how that helps, I don't know. I mean, who's worse? Somebody who decides to go in and rob a bank and shoots them for money, or somebody who is driven to kill people without knowing why. Do you treat them differently? Do you forgive one and blame the other? It's very, it's very difficult. Judges, and I've talked to a few judges about it. they say there are two separate parts of a trial in England. And Scotland is almost the same, not quite the same. There's the guilt part, right? And ours is, I think, the better system, where you have, and I've been on a jury, you have 12 randomly selected people who don't know each other and are supposed to represent the general population, which they generally do, and certainly in my experience, and to make up in their uninformed way whether the guy's telling the truth or not. And the French system is, and then the judge, who knows the guy's background, and the jurors are not supposed to know that this guy has spent 6 months in prison and murdered 14 people. They're not supposed to know this, and I think that's right. Then the judge, when he gets the verdict, and he can't direct them to a verdict. And there have been some famous cases. There was a famous case. George Blake, his name was. He was a spy who was in Parkhurst prison on the Isle of Wight, and was it Parkhurst? Yes, it was. And he managed to escape, and he was helped by people who felt he'd been imprisoned for political reasons, which is pretty clear he had been, because he was trying to show some dreadful thing the British government was doing in the 1950s, and so he escaped. And why did I? Oh yeah, then he went to Russia. He escaped and went to Russia, and he spent the rest of his life in Russia. So he was diagnosed as too dangerous to release, but once he was out, he was perfectly okay. So it's difficult, really. But clearly, some people do have a problem with anger control. But whether you treat them or whether you punish them is always the problem in justice system. The French system is different and worse. The French system has a panel of judges who decide. Now all these panels know each other. They think they can spot people who are criminals, and so they decide whether they're guilty or not. That seems to be a much worse system.
As you said, there's evidence that is inborn genetics actually going to impact how humans behave and how, like, for example, IQ, like different aspects of human beings. Then it seems to be a logical argument for some people to suggest eugenics is. Well,
you can, but you do have. We have had eugenics for years. I mean, you ask about the relative educational level of married couples. Okay, well, I've got a PhD. I'm boasting, but I've got a PhD. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society. I'm the only person in Britain who's both a fellow of the Royal Society, which is a scientific society, and the Royal Literary Society, which is people who write books. And my wife, who's got a PhD, has got more on. She's got more honours than I can think of. She's a political journalist. Her name is Norma Percy, and she makes series. She's just done one on Russia, on China and the West. It's just finished now. What day is it today? Today is Wednesday. The last one was on Monday. So we're both. I'm not boasting. We're both highly educated people who. I went to a state school, and so did she, and we kind of rose up the system. And I'm very glad that we did. But I only rose up the system because I passed lots of exams and went to university. When I went to university, the proportion of people from state schools who went to university was 1 in 50. Okay, now it's more than 50%. So obviously the boundaries have changed, and I think it's much better to have it 50% rather than 1 in 50.
Some people would defend eugenics in a way like we do that in the food industry, for example. For food industry, like have genetics, like human intervention in genetics for like maybe chicken and make them more productive, like food and stuff.
Well, you mean that's been tried. One of the German emperors, which one was it? He paid his guards, who had selected to be tall because they looked impressive. He paid them to marry tall women, and it was quite a substantial sum. So it was, that was eugenics. How good it was at increasing the size of children, I don't know, but it probably did. But there, all kinds of attributes. You find that people with similar personalities tend to marry similar. It's what we call positive associative mating, and it's true for all kinds of things. There is some negative associative mating. There is some. Obviously, one obvious one, which is so obvious you tend not to think of it, is that there are two sexes, right? That's a negative associative mating. Plenty of creatures with only one sex, and plenty of creatures with 6 sexes, but it tends to be a pretty long way down the evolutionary tree. So the idea of associative mating is eugenics, and I have no problem with that. Well, in some words, the German word, Rassenhygiene, race hygiene, is better than eugenics. I think otherwise it's not. But you can't just deny it because it exists. I mean, one of the surprising things is that people, men and women, obviously men and women until very recently have everywhere either been forbidden to marry somebody from a different race or have been reluctant to. Now that's been seen a dramatic change in my own lifetime. I mean, I was brought up in a fairly poor part of Liverpool, and where there was quite a big Chinese community, and that was very rare in those days. They'd been seamen. They'd been on ships, sailing ships, all of them, and they knew if they went back to China, they'd be much poorer than if they stayed in Britain. So they set up basically a little colony in Liverpool. Even when I was young, there was you could go to streets where there would be almost nobody but Chinese people, and they tended to marry within themselves, the group. But that too has changed, and there's rather, when you look at UCL, there's rather little what you might call race-based mate choice. There is some, and there always will be some, but things have genuinely changed. The way you can formalize it more is, and get the data from the records when you're asking about mate choice, is asking about the Mormons are really useful, because the Mormons have got this bizarre idea that you can if you can find a Mormon on your family tree, you can convert him or her without them knowing, even if they're dead. Okay, so what the Mormons have done, and their headquarters is in Salt Lake City in the States, and I've been there just to look at it. They've got the world's biggest collection of pedigrees. It's got everything. They've got every pedigree in the world. They're copies. All the Chinese pedigrees that go back to about the 6th century, some of them. All the Indian pedigrees, 100% of all of them. And they're all online. You can look at them. You can look yourself up. And just look up Mormon pedigrees and you'll find your name will be there, and you'll go back a long way. I can get back to about the 16th or 17th century. And my mother, whose name was Morgan, and that's Welsh for Ghana Moor, by the sea, because she actually lived by the sea. There was a group called Morgan. I can take her pedigree back to about the 8th century. So it's you can do it. Why you want to do it's another question. But what that tells you is that it's much harder to do now, because if you ask how far apart were married couples born, my father and my mother were born about 10 miles apart in West Wales. And I once said this in a lecture and somebody shouted, and it shows. But I was born 3,000 miles apart from where my wife, who's an American, was born. And she was born 6,000 miles apart from where her grandparents were born, because they were Russian Jews. And they left Russia and came to the United States. So, it's but now everything has opened up. The mean family distance in England, the birthplace distance in the 19th century, outside the big towns, and there was only one big town really, which was London, which was then the biggest city in the world, which is now number 47, I think, or something ridiculous. The mean distance was 10 miles. Okay, and it stayed at 10 miles, which is about as far as you can walk in a day, or an easy walk in a day. It stayed at 10 miles from about from the 1066 to the middle of the 19th century. Now it's about but whatever it is, I should know. It's certainly well over 100 miles, probably several hundred miles. If you're certainly in places like London, which is very racially mixed. If you go to Scotland, which is much less racially mixed, then it's much different. So these things are very flexible, and that's a eugenic decision. I mean, people have, as you well know, you can look at the heterozygosity, the amount of variation in DNA samples going back a long way. And what you find is that the levels of heterozygosity in my parent, in me, well, we don't have any children, but the level of heterozygosity in today's parents of young children is higher than the levels of heterozygosity in their parents, which is again higher than the levels of heterozygosity in their parents. In other words, we're getting a much more variable, to be a much more variable species. And that is eugenic, because genetic diversity, generally speaking, is very good for you. That's why they have crossbred cattle and that kind of stuff, because the more diverse you are, the fitter you are.
So, so eugenics nowadays in mainstream is quite a pure rejections. Would you say that it's quite pure political because of the historical events, or there's actually negative biological impact in eugenics that can be proven?
Yeah, I mean, it's a negative social impact of I mean, it's clearly the case. There are some people who have very low IQs or very uncontrolled personalities for biological reasons. I mean, that's easy to establish, but that doesn't say you should stop them from reproducing. There are in the States. I mean, quite recently in the States, in California, on a state law, and the states are much stronger, as you know, entities in the US than the countries of the UK are, the 4 countries of the UK. So the states sometimes say you cannot marry this person because he or she is your cousin, or even your second cousin. Okay, and some states go even further than that. Some states say you cannot. Britain once said that you cannot marry the sister. What was it? You can't marry your deceased wife's sister, right? Now that makes no sense at all, because if you're married to a woman who dies, her sister is no more related to you than any other woman is. But in Genesis, it says something which you can interpret as saying that the sister has the same identity as the man. It's in the first chapter of Genesis. I can't remember the name. And therefore, she became, once she was widowed, she couldn't marry a relative of her deceased husband. So there are all kinds of weird beliefs out there, most of which don't make much sense.
Let's move on to the scientific community.
Yeah.
As you work in the scientific community for decades, do you see much different how people view eugenics within the community? Like there's a big conflict in how people understand it, how people view it politically, perhaps, or even scientifically?
I think there has been, yes. And there's a great line in Darwin. It's in The Descent of Man, appropriately enough, because that's about human evolution. It says, ignorance more frequently breeds confidence than does knowledge. If you don't know something, it's easy to be confident, okay? And it's easy to say that all criminals are genetically inferior, but you can't just say that. And certainly when we knew almost nothing about human genetics, and by that I mean until about 1968, apart from the special case of inborn diseases, where we did know something. The first person to look at mental disorders scientifically was a guy called Penrose, and where was he? He was here in the Galton Laboratory, and he looked at schizophrenia and affective disorder and these things, and he did so very, very scientifically, and he showed strongly that there was a strongly genetic basis to it. And now we know an awful lot more about that. We know about the sequence changes involved. It's used in diagnosis. If somebody is diagnosed as a schizophrenic and kills somebody, they will be treated differently from somebody who's not diagnosed as a schizophrenic. So it's very hard to disentangle the two.
Okay. Within the scientific community, how do you think eugenic study can be in the future, perhaps? be
Well,
studied?
I think it's important to know about the past.
Mhm.
And chemists, people who do chemistry, and my dad was a
Mhm.
chemist, uh, they have no particular need to know about the history of chemistry.
Mhm.
But I do think you do have a need about the history of biology and of genetics in particular. But just to warn you really about what are the kind of problems you can fall into. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the education system I grew up in, every child, apart from rich kids, which we weren't particularly, had a 1 hour test when they were either 11 or 12. It was called the 11 plus exam. Okay, you've probably heard of it. It was just 1 hour. And when I was a schoolboy, they spent hours in my state primary school bashing into us how to do this stupid test. A is to B, as C is to blah, and all that stuff. And this shape is to that shape, and as this shape is to that shape. And I passed. Obviously, I passed. I went to it was a perfectly good school. The primary school was in a very working class part of Liverpool, and I thought it was a very good school. It was very well taught, I thought. But I think only there were 40 people in my primary school class. I was the only one to get to university. Okay, and so but the test, the 1944 education test, was set up as a eugenic test. The 11 plus exam was supposed to separate people who had inborn intellectual strengths from people who had inborn physical strengths, like, for example, being an engineer or something like that. And they would separate them, and some of them would go to grammar schools, some of them were what were called secondary modern schools, where they would be taught skills, and hopefully they would end up about the same social level. But nobody ever talked about you weren't supposed to talk about passing and failing the 11 plus, but I passed and my brother failed and he became a bricklayer. So, it was the most important day of your life, really. And a lot of the kids didn't realize that. I think I did. But I tried I'll look up 11 plus exam. And I tried an 11 plus exam online a while ago. I failed miserably. And that's because I didn't know how to do the tests. You see this shape and it's square, and this one is square but tilted over, and the next one is elongated, and you're supposed to. I just couldn't do it. So but that was a eugenic idea that you have this test which would separate the people who works with their hands from the people who work with their brains, and they would be treated the same. It was a great idea, except they weren't treated the same.
Cool. So to today's last question, you have publicly speak quite vocal about creationism and you're anti-creationism. Yes. And would you see eugenics as a form of creationism by human intervention on evolution process?
Well, creationism is just stupid. That's the only word you can use for it. I mean, I don't know how people can. They must know. I mean, first of all, I've met people who claim that humans emerged. What was it, 4,600 BC? Well, that's the evidence against that is absolutely overwhelming. It isn't true. And if you decide it is true, then you're not fooling me. You're fooling yourself. And I remember I spoke to some Mormons are an interesting lot. I spoke to a Mormon woman. I went to Salt Lake City, and they're an interesting lot. I mean, they're in many ways a very European lot. Salt Lake City, like lots of creationists, they were tremendously racist. There are very few non-white Mormons. The only ones that are Native Americans. They welcomed the Native Americans because the Mormons thought that the Native Americans were one of the lost tribes of Israel who had made it across the Atlantic, and so they were saved so they could join. So there are all these weird beliefs, but I thought people want to believe that they belong to something special. People used to think the English were special. Of course they are. I think every country thinks their citizens are special. And it depends what you mean. That's a natural thought. But I think that thought has kind of gone away. Maybe I'm wrong. But certainly one of the most racist places I've been is India. They say, but of course they're all right, but the untouchables, the Dalits as they're now called, oh no, there's no hope for them. And the place I remember it most of all was in Botswana. I worked in Botswana for a while. I can go on for hours about bloody Botswana. But this was during the days of apartheid. I was there in '68, was it? Yeah. No, it must be after that, maybe '72. And I had to go to South Africa to get into Botswana. So I flew to Joburg. And I walked around the streets of Joburg, looking around. And I'd been told not to go out because it wasn't safe. But I got away with it. I mean, it was because I was tired. I'd slept. I got up early, and I walked around Joburg. Nobody gave me any trouble. I think it was a bit unwise, and it's much more dangerous now because the things are running out of control in parts of South Africa. But then I got to the Botswana border, and it was this very surly South African guy. Why are you going to Botswana? I said, well, I'm going to be teaching there. And I'm teaching at the university. And he said, have they got a university? I said, I do. And and he said, you're going to be teaching. That's going to be difficult, isn't it? And he's been quite serious with me. Yeah. I said, I don't know. I shouldn't think so. Why should it be? Oh, he says, these people can't think. They won't be able to learn anything. Oh, bloody hell. And he obviously meant it, And then I got through this idiot, and I got to the Botswana side. And there was a Botswana entry point. And I got there was this nice black man, and he said, welcome to Botswana, sir. This is the Hampstead of Africa. And Hampstead famously was the rich place, which is in the 19th century was where the rich lived, where things were safe and all that kind of stuff. And he was right. It was the Hampstead of Africa. And, everybody was well educated. The universities were very good. The schools were good, except that there was a group in there called the Bushmen. And the Khoisan, they should have been called, but everybody still called them the Bushmen. And I used to give lectures about this and to go on about, differences between blacks and whites. And the questions were, oh yeah, I'm absolutely right. There's no differences between blacks and whites at all. Of course, there is some. But they said the Khoisan, they're not like that. And I said, why aren't they like that? He said, oh, they're not really human at all. And of course, if you make a tree, the ones that stand out are the Khoisan. The Bushmen, as they were called. They kept themselves to themselves. They're very physically different from others. They're short. They've got rather strange woolly hair. It's not like most African hair. And they believe themselves to be different, and they are different. But what difference should it make? I don't think it should.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Jones.
Okay. Well, you can always you can always steal my book. My book, I can never remember what they're called now. What's the most recent one called? I can't remember what it's called. In the language of the genes is out of date now, but if you want the simple account of racial differences, get a copy. There's several copies in the library, and there's a thing about race in there.
Thank you very much.